Mystery of Lake Anjikuni. In the dark northern winter of 1930, an entire village filled with men, women, and children vanished. Even the dead were missing from their graves. It's since been known as the Lake Anjikuni mystery, one of Canada's most enduring unsolved cases. During the harsh Canadian winter of 1930, battling falling snow and the biting cold, a weary fur trapper, Joe LaBelle, went in search of a safe haven. When he came to the Inuit village of Lake Anjikuni, all was eerily silent. Where on previous visits he had enjoyed the warmth and company of a busy and bustling community, now there was only an empty village. Upon investigation, he found fires still burning, foodstocks intact, and the villagers' belongings in place. Yet as the search continued, it became clear that the people of Lake Anjikuni had vanished. Stranger still, even the dead had disappeared from their graves. So began one of Canada's most remarkable mysteries, one that continues to haunt the vast northern wilderness to this day. Canada has a population of fewer than 40 million people and claims the title of the second largest country by sheer mass. Much of its land is extremely isolated or completely uninhabited. Lake Anjikuni is located in the province of Nunavut, which is home to the most northern, continuously inhabited place in the world. And the settlement of Alert sits just 500 miles from the North Pole. So it's fitting that this chilling story comes from a place so far north and so far from civilization. Along the shores of Lake Anjikuni, the Inuit people built their home. Connected to the Kazan River, the abundance of trout and pike first attracted the Inuit to the fertile fishing grounds, and they, in turn, enriched the lands with their culture and mystical tales of spirits and beasts, the most famous being that of the fearsome Wendigo. But then, one cold night in November 1930, the stories faded and a terrible silence descended upon the village. The Vanishing Village. During a particularly hard winter, fur trapper Joe LaBelle was exploring the northern part of the country when he decided to seek shelter. He was no stranger to the area, and Lake Anjikuni was an active spot for trappers and trade. But upon entering the village, all LaBelle found was silence. After an initial search, it soon became clear the village had been abandoned in a hurry. He found a fire, still smoking, with a fresh stew cooking over it. When he moved to inspect the dwellings of the villagers, he discovered weapons, large stocks of food, and their belongings were still in place. As to the whereabouts of the approximately 30 men, women, and children that had called the village home, LaBelle could find no trace. He suspected something terrible had happened to the villagers and knew they would never desert a habitable place for no reason or leave behind precious resources. Upon inspecting the storehouse, he found it still full of trout. LaBelle went looking for evidence of their sudden departure, but he could find no footsteps or prints in the snow. Despite the promise of food and shelter, he could not bring himself to stay in the deserted village and hiked to the nearest telegraph station to send word. Hours later, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived. As the Mounties traveled to the village, they were joined by trapper Armand Laurent and his two sons. They asked Laurent and his sons if they'd seen anything odd in the area recently, to which Laurent admitted he had seen a mysterious gleaming object in the sky a few days earlier. He said the object was airborne and was capable of changing shape, and that it had headed in the direction of Lake Anjikuni. The RCMP troop arrived in the town and met with LaBelle. While there, they were able to confirm his strange account and make a few more discoveries of their own. On the outskirts of town, in the village burial grounds, they found open and empty graves. The desecration of a resting place for a body is not only an illegal act in most communities but also considered a heinous taboo by the Inuit people. The Mounties did not believe it to be the work of animals given that the ground was frozen hard and that unearthing the bodies would require tools. The presence of stacked rocks next to each grave only added to their suspicions. The Mounties immediately ordered a search party for the missing villagers but failed to find any evidence of where the missing villagers were or what had happened to them. They did, however, discover a pack of dogs on the outskirts of the village that had died of starvation before being covered by snow. This unnerved the party, considering massive stores of food and shelter were only meters away from where the dogs had reportedly died. Though some historical researchers later claimed the dogs had been tied up when they were found, it still leaves the question as to how they managed to die so quickly when it was apparent the village had been abandoned only hours before Lebel's initial arrival. Lights in the sky and strange conclusions. As if this tale weren't strange enough, RCMP officers stated they saw mysterious pulsing lights in the sky above Lake Anjikuni while investigating the scene. Now, the lights in the sky of northern Canada are not abnormal. The northern lights are a beautiful natural phenomenon that can be seen from even the most southern parts of the country, but the lights these search and rescue men found were not at all like the natural wonder they were used to seeing. The lights they saw on the horizon were bluish and pulsing, quite unlike the northern lights. Much like the entire case, the lights were never explained. After a long and arduous investigation, the RCMP officers used berries found nearby to determine that the villagers had been gone for almost 2 months. This begged the question, who had been using their village site if they were gone, and why? The first press account of the ordeal appeared in the newspaper La Pas, Manitoba, where reporter Emmett Kelleher first published a story on the disappearance in November 1930. Shortly thereafter, another newspaper, the Danville Bee of Quebec, published the story as well. The report that propelled the case into the national spotlight was the article published in the Halifax Herald that named the abandoned location the Village of the Dead in its headline. From there, the story circulated to countless newspapers, crossing the continent before eventually fading from common consciousness. In 1959, author Frank Edwards included the story in his book Stranger Than Science. This earned the attention of the RCMP, who now claimed the event never happened and that Edwards had made it up to improve book sales. Though many agree that Edwards more than likely embellished much of the story for his book, the fact remains that there are documented press accounts from the 1930s about the disappearance. There are also records of 2 investigations carried out by the RCMP into the event, with the latter taking place in 1931. With interest in the case renewed, further research was conducted into the 2 separate investigations. It was discovered that Lebel was new to the Northern Territories and was not the seasoned trapper he had claimed to be. It also came to light that Emmett Kelleher was well known to be a sensationalist journalist who had often written stories about the wild north for the sake of a dramatic headline. The final word on the matter paints Lebel as an inexperienced trapper who didn't have the knowledge or the experience to know what he saw at the abandoned village, and that the initial newspaper report was largely based on Kelleher's wild imagination and hearsay. The RCMP ruled the disappearance as a seasonal or permanent abandonment, given the nomadic nature of the Inuit people, though they noted it was odd for them to leave behind their weapons and provisions. Many do not take the RCMP's official stance with much credence, which has left the case wide open for some colorful alternative conclusions. A popular theory passed around by UFO enthusiasts is largely based upon the accounts of the RCMP officers who witnessed the strange lights in the skies during the initial investigation, that, and the odd flying object reported by the Laurent. They speculate that the Inuit were the victims of a mass alien abduction, taken directly from their homes. Other theories delve into the Inuits' core belief system and the malevolent spirits in their pantheon. While the Wendigo is an alluring option, considering it seems to have become the patron forest monster of Canada, some believe the Inuits' sky god, Torngarsuk, was responsible, if something otherworldly was indeed involved. Another popular theory is that the members of the village were somehow pulled into another dimension. As is often the case, the truth about what really happened at Lake Anjikuni has become distorted. With the passing of time, fact has given way to fiction, making the distinction between the two nearly impossible. Yet, at its core, the story remains strange to tell, with no real conclusion, rational or supernatural, if it ever happened at all. The mysterious fates of those missing villagers are a popular ghost story to share around a campfire, especially when told under the night sky in the wilds of the Canadian North. What happened in the Anjikuni Lake Village? We are all left in the middle of nowhere here. This huge conundrum is real, and no one knows what or who was responsible for the appalling disappearance of the Inuits in the 1930s. The disappearance of the Anjikuni Eskimo remains a great mystery. The Lake Anjikuni disappearances have always been the most significant point of argument between those who assume that the Anjikuni tribe mystifyingly vanished. Hey, you can also take a tour of the island of the haunted dolls. What makes it more of an enigmatic mystery is the fact that there wasn't any hint of struggle or violence found. Even if we are to believe that they were murdered or abducted, there has to be some kind of sign of the commotion. This, amalgamated with the fact that experienced trackers couldn't find any indication of the pathway those 30 people took while leaving the village, has left the researchers stymied for centuries. This, amalgamated with the fact that experienced trackers couldn't find any indication of the pathway those 30 people took while leaving the village, has left the researchers hindered for centuries. Aliens. In the late 20th century, various ufologists conjectured that the inhabitants of this village might have been the innocent victims of one of history's most significant mass alien abductions. Though the proof backing this hypothesis is anecdotal at best, the assumption is equally exciting and dreadful at the same time. Envisaging this theory of aliens diving down and escaping with the whole population of a village is the matter from which this nightmare is created, another dimension. There are tons of stories of people who have mystifyingly vanished in the past. Take the unusual case of Orion Williamson. He was a farmer from Selma, Alabama. He allegedly disappeared into thin air right in front of his children, wife, and 2 neighbors when he was strolling across his home. You can also take a tour of the haunted place of Louisiana, Calcasieu Courthouse, Lake Charles. The entire community started searching for him. However, he was nowhere to be found, although the farmer's son swore that he heard his father's ghostly cries coming from the field for several weeks after his disappearance. Then comes the case of a shoemaker, James Byrne Worson, from Warwickshire, England. James's predilection for boasting about his long-distance running capabilities had ultimately weakened the patience of his drinking buddies. They challenged him to run 40 miles from Leamington to Coventry. Worson took the challenge, and within an hour, the 3 of them were on their way to jogging. Worson gave the impression of enjoying himself, and he was running at a hard speed and teasing his friends until he slipped only 20 feet in front of them. In morbid fear, they saw their friend falling right in front of them, with a dreadful cry of trepidation, and vanishing before their very eyes. As in the case of Williamson, Worson was never to be found. These occurrences of inexplicable vanishings are genuine. Something that even witnesses find it hard to explain. Whatever the case may be, the fact will always be in history that on a chilly November night in 1930, roughly 30 men, women, and children abandoned their homes and disappeared from the earth.